24 to 9. It's Tuesday. You've bought something and paid for it later, right? A car is pretty common. A house, of course, very common. What about the smaller items? Clothes, jewellery, devices?
It seems more common now, perhaps, than before. They refer to it as financial technologies or Fintech, representing a bit of a shift in the economic landscape, particularly as it affects young people. So this buy now, pay later type of service, changing modes of payment, maybe misunderstanding debt a little bit, but it's also making young people able to buy or trade or find themselves in debt in really just a couple of clicks.
So experts say more research is needed, more understanding is required so that young people can find a better future financially. One expert is Stephen Threadgold, an associate professor and director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre.
He's leading a public lecture in Newcastle tonight. Good morning.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Has the financial landscape really changed very much as compared to previous generations?
Yeah, well, it's kind of unrecognisable from when, I was in the early 90s leaving school, going to get a car loan and, having to put on a suit and go and take my dad with me. Things are much more accessible these days. You can get loans for all kinds of things at the click of a button, and particularly with the buy now, pay later stuff, for smaller purchases, I suppose. They're very unregulated, almost not regulated at all in Australia. There's been recent chats about getting them regulated. It's starting to come in, but it is going to be self-regulation. The landscape's very different. And definitely, I think the financial situation for young people at the moment is extremely different than it was for previous generations.
What do you see as the problem with the regulations then? What needs to change, and what are the dangers when it isn't regulated well?
There's dangers on both sides, really. Obviously, if it isn't regulated, you can get really easy access to them. There's not just kind of one or two buy now, pay laters in Australia these days. There's, I think, maybe 10 or 12 or something. So you can actually have an account of each one. And obviously the potential there for trouble is larger. What we're also finding, though, is that what happens when regulation comes into these things is they tend to be regulated in ways that really replicate previous inequalities. So one of our presentations tonight by Bev Skeggs, who's a very prominent UK sociologist, she kind of got into the back end of various online platforms to find out how they categorise us and therefore how they then send us advertisements or not. And if you're in a good category that they like, that is, relatively wealthy and living in urban areas and probably white, they'll send you ads for almost anything. And but if you're in what they call the low-hanging fruit categories, they only send you ads for kind of debt agencies and budget supermarkets. So these things are kind of categorising us in the background as well. So there's a kind of play-off here between access into credit in a world that's like really hard for young people to afford things, but also the ability to kind of then get into trouble.
You are taking a look at what you're referring to as the gamification of debt as part of this as well. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, the buy now, pay later apps in particular enrol a bunch of different digital methods into them to try and attract people to them, but also then keep you on there. And gamification is one aspect of that. So they send you kind of little kind of digital rewards and stuff every now and then and congratulate you for making purchases, or they remind you that, 12 months ago you bought this thing and would you like to look at buying something else? Others kind of use things like, the kind of Spotify thing that you get every year, tells you all the songs that you listen to.
The big recap, yes.
Yeah, they do that, then they kind of recount all the things you've done. So, like poker machines and all that kind of stuff before, they enroll these kind of psychological mechanisms to try and keep people, not just young people, any people, on them and using them as much as possible. They're even like shops now themselves. They have shops in them so they're not really just I suppose, entry to consume stuff. We see them as actually things that people consume. Because there's so many of them, you kind of have to make choices, which one is yours and all that kind of thing. So they're like a consumption item as well as being a gate towards consumption.
A lot of what I learnt about money, and even just the way I approach money today, I learned from my parents. Now, That's one thing, because not a lot necessarily changed there, but I can imagine parents today may not even know about the buy now, pay later, may not even use some of this gamification that you're talking about, some of the fintech stuff, but they're trying to teach or at least their young people are using it without them even knowing as parents what it is. So is there a role for parents to play here in terms of learning it, or should schools be doing a better job? Where's the learning coming from now?
Look, they're great questions. There's so many things to say about that. Definitely something like financial literacy that is taught in some schools is useful, but it's kind of taught like maths. And, there's been some stories in the paper recently how, young people are kind of failing those things. But I would say a lot of people would fail those things. But really, when it comes to literacy and finances, it's not just about maths. It's about kind of the realistic situation of your life. And, money is emotional. It's difficult to kind of, I think, talk about financial literacy and making rational decisions if people are kind of making a choice between, I don't know, heating their house or having something to eat, right? That becomes a kind of different debate. So, even in a survey we did last year, led by my colleagues Julia Cook and Josh Healy, we surveyed 570 odd young people in the Hunter Valley and in Newcastle, and nearly 40% of them had said in the last month they'd skipped a meal because they couldn't afford it. Mm-hmm. But this is a first world, so-called first world country, a developed world. Like these are problems that are spreading out. So cost of living is really harsh. You're definitely right in terms of how parents mightn't understand the gamification or beyond those things as much, but certainly parents are very important when, for instance, are getting into the housing market.
There will be there'll be people listening now who say, well, young people now just want everything straight away. They don't have the restraint or the discipline that previous generations have had. Yeah. And that's why they end up in this kind of trouble. What do you say to that?
Well, I think every older generation says that about the younger generation. It's been going back to Aristotle. He wrote similar things about that back then. So, so aspects of that are kind of true in the sense that, but the basic things that young people do change, and it looks a lot different to previous generations, but the economic circumstances are very plain. In 1990, the average wage in New South Wales was about $26,000, and the median house price in Sydney, unit price was about $135, 5 times the average wage. Now it's like $70,000 and $837, which is 12 times the wage. The economic circumstances here are starkly different. So the idea you can save up a bit longer makes sense rhetorically, but it's like 10, 15 years longer, to actually get a $80,000 deposit rather than, say, a $5,000 one. So it's a bit, offhand and doesn't really take into consideration the actual circumstances of young people. And this is also the fact that many of them have $60,000 HEX debts and stuff like that as well built into this. We also have an absurd situation where if you rent for a long period of time and pay your rent every week for, say, 5 years, this doesn't seem to count as any kind of mechanism to be able to get you a mortgage when you're very obviously a quite reliable person if you're doing that. So there's all kinds of different things that we can look at, I think, to improve the situation of young people financially, and particularly when it comes to the housing market. That isn't just about building more houses, which is obviously something that needs to happen as well.
Stephen, really interesting. All the best with tonight's lecture. We'll give the details in a second, but thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Stephen Threadgold there, an Associate Professor, Director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre, and leading that public lecture tonight at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, so if you'd like to register for that, if you just search Fintech Lecture Newcastle, you'll come up with that. I'm happy to send you the link. If you text us now, I can send that straight through to you. But Fintech Lecture Newcastle, you'll find a link to register. It's free. It's on Zoom if you would like to be there. It's a